As a result of these developments, the breadth and the depth of the changes in U.S. trade policy have become more fully apparent.
Imagine that one morning America wakes up and the familiar world order no longer exists. Without a single shot fired, without coups or loud declarations, power on the continent has passed into other hands. Not to enemies, not to corporations, and not to the military, but to those who have always been considered quiet, polite, and predictable. To the north, to Canada.
And to these ends, the United States has announced a series of trade actions. Those began near the start of this year with the so-called IEEPA tariffs against Canada and Mexico based on U.S. concerns about the border and fentanyl trafficking.
For decades, this country lived in the shadow of the United States, supplying oil, gas, electricity, and metals without claiming leadership. It was called a quiet neighbor, an exemplary ally, a junior partner. But everything changed when officials in a small coastal town in British Columbia uttered a simple word: no. The refusal to renew the license to export electricity to the United States marked the beginning of the quietest and most effective revolution in North American history. While Washington was discussing the latest tariffs and trade agreements, Ottawa was developing a new strategy. The Canadian government did not make loud statements, threaten sanctions, or build walls. It simply began to redirect flows of energy, raw materials, and technology. While American analysts were making predictions, Canada was signing deals with Indonesia, Mexico, and the largest countries in Europe. It was turning its resources from commodities into instruments of power.
This new U.S. trade policy has several motivations: to raise tariff revenues, to protect strategic industries, to encourage foreign investment in the United States, and to change trade and non-trade policy in U.S. partners.
While the U.S. was mired in an energy crisis and internal bureaucracy, Canada began investing billions in the extraction of lithium, nickel, and rare earth metals, the very elements without which the production of batteries, electronics, and military technology is impossible. Within a few years, dozens of new enterprises, laboratories, and transport corridors connecting the Atlantic, Arctic, and Pacific Oceans appeared on the country's map. A program called North Shift changed everything. Now Canada could control not only the supply of resources, but also the routes by which they were delivered. By the time the White House finally realized the scale of what was happening, it was too late. American industry's dependence on northern supplies had become critical. The phrase Canadian threat appeared in Pentagon reports for the first time. But this threat had no army, did not launch missiles, and did not issue ultimatums. It was measured in kilowatts, barrels, and tons of metal. Europe, weakened by the energy crisis, turned to Canada. Germany, France, and the Netherlands signed agreements for the supply of hydrogen and processed minerals. Asia demanded Canadian nickel and cobalt. And the US, accustomed to dictating terms, suddenly found itself in the position of a supplicant.
The United States has also imposed substantial trade actions on the Canadian lumber industry. Now, in recent weeks, the United States has agreed a series of trade deals with a variety of countries. And these deals have several aspects in common. First, baseline tariffs that cover a broad range of goods and services that are substantially higher than those U.S. tariffs that existed before.
Thus, before our very eyes, without bloodshed or loud slogans, the geoeconomic map of the world changed. The Canadian economy, until recently dependent on its southern neighbor, became the backbone of a new energy order. Washington no longer controls the North. It depends on it. This is not fantasy, not a political thriller, and not a TV series script. It is a reality for which America was not prepared. How did Canada manage to turn silence into strength? Why did one decision by a small town set off a domino effect across the continent? And what lies ahead for North America? Until recently, it seemed impossible to imagine that the US could one day wake up to a world where its influence was no longer decisive. But it didn't start with a crisis, a war, or even sanctions. It began with a few cautious remarks made in Ottawa, and with the fact that no one in Washington took them seriously. When Canadian officials said that the country must rethink its approach to the use of its own resources, American analysts just smiled. They were used to seeing Canada as a reliable partner, predictable and dependent on export ties to the South. But even then, a plan was being prepared within the Canadian government that would later be called the energy revolution of the decade. America was coasting along. Trade agreements such as the ISMACA, Familiar supply chains, military cooperation agreements, everything seemed unbreakable. But in reality, the balance had long begun to shift. According to open sources, Canada provides up to 80% of the electricity imported into the US, about a quarter of its uranium, and millions of barrels of oil every day. These figures have always been perceived as a guarantee of stability, as a given that does not require attention. But behind this stability lay fatigue decades, during which the northern country sold its riches at below market prices, gaining in return dependence on the American market and Washington's foreign policy decisions.
Those were quickly followed by reciprocal tariffs on every U.S. trade partner and very high sectoral tariffs applied globally on strategic industries, including steel, aluminum, autos, and copper.
Everything changed on the day when, in a small coastal town in British Columbia, almost unnoticed by the world's media, the municipal authorities refused to renew the license to export cheap electricity to the United States. Officially, this was explained by concern for the environment and growth in domestic demand, but there was much more to it than that. The decision was agreed upon with the provincial government and then quietly supported in Ottawa. This was the first shot in a new war without weapons, but with far more devastating consequences. At first glance, it all looked like a local episode, almost an accident. However, within a few weeks, American think tanks began to pick alarming signals. Closed reports appeared in Washington stating that energy dependence on our northern neighbor has reached a critical level. This was particularly acute in the border states, where 40% of the power grids were fed by Canadian electricity. Newspapers did not write about this openly, but panic began within government structures. When journalists asked for comments, a State Department spokesperson said the usual: "We see no reason for concern. Relations with Canada remain strategic and friendly." However, emergency meetings were already taking place behind the scenes. Sources in the U.S. Energy Committee later claimed that the first reports of possible supply disruptions had come in a month before the public statements. They said that even a short-term reduction in electricity exports from Canada could lead to a 20 to 25% price increase in the northern states.
Specifically, under the new U.S. approach, countries must now buy access to the world's largest economy through a combination of tariffs, investments, unilateral trade liberalization, and policy changes in their home markets.
While the White House was trying to understand what was happening, Canada was moving forward. The country's Minister of Natural Resources, known for his restraint, unexpectedly made a statement that sounded like a challenge. "Our energy must serve, first and foremost, the interests of Canadians." It was said without loud slogans, but the meaning was crystal clear. Canada no longer intends to be an appendage of a foreign economy. A quiet but large-scale restructuring began within the country. The federal government launched dozens of projects to build its own processing plants, energy hubs, and infrastructure lines connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. Exploration for new nickel and lithium deposits began in the Northern Territories, and construction of electric vehicle battery factories began in the central provinces. This was no longer simply industrial development, it was a declaration of sovereignty, expressed in megawatts and tons of metal. American experts were initially skeptical. At economic forums, comments were heard that Canadians are incapable of acting without Washington's approval, but it soon became clear that they were wrong. Within a few months, Canada signed a series of agreements with Indonesia and European countries, opening up alternative routes for the supply of rare earth materials. And after the US raised tariffs on steel and aluminum, Ottawa responded in kind, but did so gently and consistently, without threats, simply redirecting export flows.
As in previous trade disputes, Canada has implemented a series of retaliatory tariffs. Their objectives have been to protect Canadian workers and businesses and to incentivize a negotiated settlement with the United States. A few other countries followed suit.
Thus began a new phase: economic warfare. It was waged without weapons, without armies, and without direct statements, but its effect was stronger than any conflict. Canada ceased to be just a supplier, it became a controller. Several independent research institutes in Toronto and Vancouver began publishing analytical materials that spoke of a new economic architecture of the North. These documents soon found their way onto the desks of US senators. They warned that if the trend continued, the US risked losing not only its energy independence but also its influence in key industries. While analysts argued about who was to blame, Something more than just economic reforms was happening within Canada. A society accustomed to modesty and self-deprecation in the face of its powerful southern neighbor suddenly felt confident. Newspapers began to write about the Canadian model of the 21st century. Universities launched courses on economic nationalism, and slogans appeared on the streets: Canadian energy for Canadians. This was not aggression, but a new pride, a manifestation of awareness of its own weight.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Washington still hoped that this was a temporary crisis, but anxiety was growing. When electricity prices in the northern states rose by almost a third, and the construction of several energy facilities was frozen due to a shortage of materials, Congress openly discussed the Canadian factor for the first time. Senators demanded reports from the Department of Energy and the State Department, while the press services of both agencies responded with standard phrases about the need to strengthen partnerships. Meanwhile, Canada continued to act calmly and coolly. The Prime Minister spoke at international forums about the fair distribution of resources and a new energy ethic. These words sounded mild, but there was power behind them. The American media called what was happening an energy coup without shots fired, and there was something strikingly accurate about that.
In fact, the average U.S. tariff rate on the world has jumped from just over 2% at the end of last year to almost 16%, 8 times higher. 16% currently.
While the US was trying to find a way out of its growing dependence, a real industrial boom was taking place in the Canadian provinces. New power plants, processing complexes, and logistics terminals were all being built in record time. In some regions, employment reached historic highs, and GDP growth exceeded that of the US for the first time in half a century. All this was presented as a natural development of the economy, but each step was part of a carefully thought-out strategy. By the middle of the decade, Washington could no longer ignore the obvious. Canada had stopped playing by American rules. Its decisions no longer depended on its neighbors' approval, and its own resources had become a tool of influence. The US, once accustomed to the role of arbiter, was forced to watch as its quiet neighbor took control of key energy flows on the continent.
Those trade deals with other countries also have limited or no relief from those sectoral tariffs in those strategic industries such as steel and autos. They include substantial commitments by the U.S. trade partners for investments in the United States and significant unilateral trade liberalization measures.
But that was only the beginning. The economic war that began with a single no in a small town turned into a process that changed the balance of power. And now, with Canada dictating terms for the first time in decades, Washington realized that a new power had emerged on the continent, not a military one, but a resource-based one. A force that cannot be threatened and cannot be argued with. A force that grew out of silence. While Washington continued to argue about tariffs and geopolitics, a completely different conversation was taking place in Ottawa. There, they were no longer discussing whether to change strategy, they were deciding how exciting side to do it as quietly and effectively as possible. Canada realized that its weakness could actually become a strength. After all, in a world where energy resources and rare earth metals have become new weapons, a country that has both can dictate terms without firing a single shot. American dependence on northern supplies had long become habitual, almost invisible. Like oxygen, everyone knew it was there, but no one thought about what would happen if it ran out. It was at this moment that the Canadian government launched a series of steps that would later be called the resource strategy of the new century.
An attack of any sort on this country is an attack on Canada as a member of the NATO alliance.
It began with a simple principle: stop selling resources as raw materials and start selling them as influence. This meant revising all export agreements, creating new alliances, and controlling every stage of the chain, from extraction to processing. Within 2 years, dozens of companies producing battery components, catalysts, and rare earth concentrates had started operating in the country. Deposits that had recently been considered unprofitable were given a new lease on life, thanks to government investment and agreements with European and Asian partners. While the US continued to discuss energy independence, Canada was already building a new energy geography independent of American routes. A program that was hardly ever mentioned publicly played a special role, an infrastructure project connecting the Pacific Ocean to the Atlantic via the northern provinces. It included the modernization of ports, the laying of new railway lines, and the construction of underground pipelines for the transportation of hydrogen and liquefied gas. According to a report leaked to the press, this project made it possible to redirect up to 60% of export flows without using American territory. When these figures reached the White House, a closed meeting was held at the National Security Council, where the phrase "we are losing the North" was heard for the first time.
In a positive and very important development earlier this month, just a few weeks ago, the United States reaffirmed a core commitment to our free trade agreement, CUSMA, by reinforcing that those Canadian exports to the United States that are compliant with that agreement, that are compliant with CUSMA, will not be subject to U.S. IEEPA tariffs.
Meanwhile, a quiet technological explosion was taking place in Canadian laboratories. Scientists and engineers who had received large grants from the government were developing new methods for processing lithium and cobalt, making it possible to almost completely abandon Chinese technologies. This was a sensation for Europe, which was seeking an alternative to Asian supplies. Just 1 year after the program was launched, Canada signed agreements with Germany and France to supply processed minerals for the production of batteries and hydrogen systems. The European press wrote that a new energy pillar of the West has appeared on the world map. The American reaction was belated and contradictory. On the one hand, Washington tried to maintain the illusion of partnership, declaring mutual dependence and mutualities. On the other hand, it prepared a series of economic measures designed to regain control. This led to new tariffs on steel, aluminum, and later on finished energy components. Congress even discussed introducing quotas on electricity imports from Canada, but experts warned that this would hurt the US itself, not Ottawa. Too many American companies depended on Canadian materials, and it was too late to change anything. Washington gradually realized that something bigger was unfolding under the guise of trade disputes. EIA and Pentagon analytical documents began to feature phrases such as Canadian energy pressure strategy and economic diversification of threats. One report stated outright that if Canada decided to restrict oil or uranium exports, the consequences for American industry could be comparable to a large-scale cyber attack. Such statements seemed unthinkable not long ago. After all, Canada is a member of NATO, an ally, and a participant in NORAD. But now mistrust has arisen within these alliances. At the same time, something was happening within Canada itself that Washington feared most: the consolidation of society around the idea of resource sovereignty. The phrase "Canadian resources for Canadians" became not a slogan, but a principle of state policy. Public opinion polls showed that more than 70% of citizens supported restricting energy exports to the United States. This was not a protest movement, but a new unity of feeling that the country had finally emerged from the shadows. Against the backdrop of this energy shift, the United States faced a crisis that had been brewing for a long time. After decades of tariff policies and the transfer of production abroad, the infrastructure was worn out, and projects to build new networks were frozen. According to leaked data from the Department of Energy, by the end of the decade, America could face more than 700 hours of power outages per year. For a country accustomed to considering itself an industrial leader, this was humiliating. And every analyst understood that behind these figures lay dependence on northern supplies. When one of Canada's provinces announced a reduction in oil export quotas for the sake of internal stability, Washington's reaction was swift. There were urgent meetings, calls at all levels, and attempts to exert pressure through international organizations. But Ottawa remained ice-cold calm. The official response was short: "This is a matter of domestic policy and national interests." And behind this response was a new reality: Canada could now afford to talk to the US on equal terms. This situation was a turning point not only for North America, but for the entire Western alliance system. Europe, seeking to rid itself of its dependence on the Middle East and Russia, saw Canada as the ideal partner, reliable, stable, and rich in resources. When Germany and France signed energy agreements with Ottawa, the American press wrote about a new transatlantic bridge built without Washington's participation. Asia did not stand aside either. Japan and South Korea proposed joint investments in the processing of rare metals. Thus, Canada transformed from a regional player into a global economic intermediary between the West and the East. But this was not the most painful thing for the US. The most frightening thing was the realization that the whole process was happening right before their eyes, slowly and steadily, and no one was trying to stop it. When American analysts began to talk about the Canadian factor, it was already an admission of defeat. One of the leaked White House memos stated bluntly, "We underestimated the scale of the changes. Canada is no longer predictable.